Good afternoon, Groundswell. You're coming from Fielding in New Zealand. Fielding is spelled correctly. It was named after Lord Fielding, and nestled into Fielding is Palmerston North, a university city. Palmerston was named after Lord Palmerston, a British Prime Minister, and William Massey created Massey University, which is the jewel in the crown of Palmerston North. A graduate of Massey University, long-time lecturer, soil scientist and engineer is Dr. John Baker. Welcome, John. You've challenged your audience to talk about the fact that as no-tillage people, they're only 50% of the way there to refining that technique. Now, John, welcome, and what do you mean by that?
Thank you, Malcolm, and good morning, Groundswell. The challenge that Malcolm's just issued, or just repeated, is correct. I don't believe that most no-tillage is anything more than 50% mastered, pretty well anywhere in the world. And this slide, I hope, illustrates it. If you look at the average yield of wheat over the last 25 years, it hasn't changed pretty well in any country you can go to, despite the fact that all the things above ground, like genetics, herbicides, pesticides, fungicides, and precision farming have come to place, and they've increased the ability to grow crops and increase yield. All the things below the soil haven't really advanced at all. Even though no-tillage has become, it's not mainstream, but it's become a common word, but we've got minimum tillage, we've got strip tillage, we've got a whole lot of things that are actually not helping soil carbon, soil microbes, compaction, soil moisture, and even the innovation on opener design is pretty limited. We keep copying each other's and repeating it. What should happen is that these things, the above ground companion technologies should continue to improve, but these things below the ground should improve as well. And what this session's all about is actually looking how we can improve these through the design of the seed drills and the openers that you use. End result started 2015. By 2050 we should have increased the crop yields, and then we can feed the other 50% of people that by then are going to be occupying the planet.
John, tell me about the key functions of no-till openers. What should they do?
Well, there's actually quite a big list of what they should do, but I've listed here the 5 most important of them. Later on we'll talk about some of the others, but primarily they have to micromanage the crop residues. Most people who are doing no-tillage today regard residues as something of a nuisance. If you've got tined openers, they block them up. If you've got disc openers, they're in danger of hairpinning. And yet they're the single biggest resource that no-tillage has. So we're going to talk about that. And along with that is minimising soil disturbance. And we'll certainly tell you the downside, even though we were all brought up, including me, to believe that a seed needs to be embedded in a fine, firm, well-cultivated seed bed. That turned out to be nonsense. They don't. And we'll talk about that. Create a fail-safe slot environment. Isn't that just a case of soil-seed contact? No, it's not. There are things we found over the last 30 years that we didn't know about. And we'll talk about that. And then place and cover the seeds at a consistent depth. Well, that's pretty obvious. That's one that we all accept. And be able to ban fertiliser at seeding, not so obvious. Most of Europe, including the UK, tends to broadcast at seeding. A lot of seed drills don't even have the capability of putting fertiliser down the spout. But in no-tillage, the rules change, and that becomes very important.
John, that's surprising to me that very few can do all 5. What's the reason for that? Is there something to do with the invisibles?
Yes, it is. The way we see it is that the 50% that we believe we've mastered, or farmers around the world have mastered in no-tillage, are all the obvious things. Don't plough, don't disturb, all the things you can see. But what's going on and is what's influencing the other 50% is invisible things. Water vapour, humidity. You'll probably be scratching your heads and think, how on earth can that play a role? Carbon dioxide. Yes, we can see carbon in its solid form, but we can't see CO2. How does the soil contribute there? And of course soil microbes. The little fellas, 6 million of them in a cup full of undisturbed soil, about the same number as there is people on the planet. They are the key at the end of the day to soil health.
Let's take water vapour first. John, what's so important about it?
Well, we didn't know that water vapour played any role in the whole no-tillage game at all. And I started the research in this in 1967, and the very first very first test that I did, I reproduced the shape of slots that were currently being made by drills that were on the market. And one of those was a V-shaped slot made by double discs. Another one was a U-shaped slot made by tine or hoe-type openers and even angled discs. And in these tests I had room to test one more opener. So I thought, well, what can I do just for the hell of it? And so I took the double disc, which is a V-shaped slot, which is wide at the top and narrow at the bottom. And I thought, why don't I make one that's wide at the bottom and narrow at the top? And there was no more logic to that than exactly that, just doing something different. So we called that an inverted T, because in reality it's pretty hard to make a slot that tips a V upside down. But in the end, what we wound up making was a horizontal slot. And you'll see me talking on this presentation a lot about horizontal slots or inverted T. I'm meaning the same thing. But here we are in a deliberately dried soil where we were getting 27% emergence of wheat after about 3 weeks. And this experimental one gave us 77%. Didn't believe it, frankly. And so we went back and repeated it. And all my grad students, there were 27 of them, they all had to repeat it as well. Well, not all of them, most of them did, and they all got the same results. So we knew something was going on, but it took us about another 5 or 6 years to actually explain it. And the explanation is that this is a silt loam soil, just a common in garden variety silt loam, magnified a couple of zillion times. And in all the pore spaces, there is 100% humidity in the soil air. Now, apparently the soil physicists knew this, but they didn't know that it had any practical implication. What they also didn't realise, or nobody realised, that when we go out and cultivate the soil, we let all that humidity escape. So the only thing we've got left to germinate seeds is water films that cling to the particles themselves, what we call colloidal films, and the seeds get in contact with that. That's where your soil seed contact thing comes in, and that's what germinates them. But if you don't let all that humidity out, you can actually germinate the seeds in just the humidity alone without the access to liquid water. You can actually put a seed on a table and put a jar over the top of it with 100% humidity, and in most cases you'll germinate the seed. It takes a little longer, but it does germinate. Here's the common slots that we tested. There's your V-shaped slot from double disc. There's a hoe slot with some loose soil falling back in it because it tends to burst the soil out. And this is the inverted T one. And here's the figures that we measured in terms of the loss of this humidity from the slot zone. Alongside here, you've still got your 100% humidity in the pore spaces, but when you open a gap like that, where it comes out is in the slot. And we were losing 3.68% of relative humidity per day, and then into the hoe where there's a little bit of loose soil, that dropped to 2.41, and in the inverted T or horizontal slot it was right down to 1.6, which is roughly half of that. And that is what accounted for that graph, but it took us several years to actually get there. This was taken only a couple of years ago in New Zealand, and I think it follows an English discovery that if in a cultivated seed bed, when you sow the seed, if you put plastic over it, it germinates quicker and the plant grows strongly. Yes, that's probably right. But what you're doing is actually closing the door after the horse has bolted. You cultivate it, the humidity escapes, so you put some plastic over it to try and collect some humidity again, and you do. But what an expensive way of achieving what you could have done with a no-tillage drill that never opened the soil up in the first place. So that makes me giggle a bit when I see people realising it after the event. Here is a horizontal slot, or the inverted T. In this case, we've got a central disc comes down here and actually makes a slit right down into the soil below, and two wings come along the side, the disc, and they lift the side flaps up, put the seed in on one side, fertiliser in on the other side, and then close it up like a zipper. And so you've got seeds actually sitting on two horizontal shelves, where all other no-tillage openers have the seed sitting in some form of a vertical slot. And that, frankly, is the key to why those slots perform so well. Here's the same thing in a different soil, more friable soil. The disc slit is difficult to see because the soil has collapsed around it because it's friable. But there's some barley seed on the left-hand side, fertiliser on the right-hand side, and when the zipper's closed, it looks like this. In fact, it's in many cases hard to see, particularly at night, where you've been.
John, you've talked about water vapour, but there are two other invisibles that you need to tell us about.
Yeah, well, before I leave the water vapour, this relates to water, but not necessarily in the vapour phase. One of the biggest causes of failure in no-tillage is when you drill into a damp plastic soil like this, and then you get hot, dry winds after it, and they dry the soil out and cause the slot to shrink. And with most no-tillage openers, that'll be a failure. If the birds don't get the seed, there's no humidity in there, and they'll probably die of desiccation. With a horizontal slot, if you look down here, I've lifted actually one of the flaps off the row so you can see where the seed was. And in fact, the seed was planted over here off to one side on one of those shelves. It germinated, saw some light, headed right, got into the middle of the slot, saw some more light, and then turned the corner and came up again. So it's gone through two right-angle bends to come out of the soil, and so is that, but you can't see them from the surface. And you might think, well, goodness, they're not designed to have those sort of bends. But imagine it's a pipe carrying water, exactly the same thing. You can go through a few bends and the water flows fine. So these crops performed absolutely fine. It's just that you didn't know what was going on under there. And had they been sown with almost any other no-tillage drill, that would have been a failure. Same thing with barley. It's a bit harder to see here, but you can see the barley plants are actually coming out of the side. I mean, you can't get a soil much more hostile than that, certainly in no-tillage. But the seeds, you can't see the seeds at any point. They were over here. They're not going to come straight up. This is too cemented. They chase the light and come up here at a bit of an angle, and they perform just fine. What does this mean in practice? Well, the very reason that we got into no-tillage was to try and eliminate this sort of hit and miss, which is still going on right across the world. That's a very common opener, in fact probably the most common opener used in the world right now. But the end effect is it works in some conditions and not in others, and here's a field where we've got both of those. Alongside, the North Dakota State University was trying out cross-slot with the horizontal slots, and the proof of the cake's in the pudding. There's all of the unevenness there is in that field as well, and most of those plants probably germinated under the influence of the water vapour, which wasn't there in those particular fields. Same thing in Germany, side-by-side plots, horizontal slot, in inverted T openers here on the left, and again single disc opener on the right. This one was, I think, is probably the best illustration we've got. It's in eastern Washington, dry soil. On the left here, not a double disc opener, but in fact a hoe type opener, pretty common one. Stirs the soil up, you can see a lot of disturbance. You can see that these are side by side. Here's the intermediate row in both cases, and that's shown with the horizontal slot and the cross slot. It's not only the vapor phase water, it's not only the lack of water that can affect the whole thing, it's too much water as well. In this situation, here's a bare soil that was damp when we drilled it. This is drilled with a horizontal slot, or the inverted T if you like. And what you're looking at there is soil with high oxygen, medium oxygen, and low oxygen. And that's pretty well how the undisturbed soil looked before we drill it. In other words, it had no particular effect on the soil physically. And we'll talk a little bit later on biologically what it did. But here's another one of the failings of the double disc opener or the V-shaped slot. It wedges the soil aside, so your low oxygen soil here is right beside the seed. There's a little bit of medium oxygen soil right around it, but the high oxygen soil can't get to it, so you wind up with a failure from that because it's just the soil is just compacted. It's as simple as that. You might ask the question about infiltration of water into the slot. In this case, we put infiltrometers, which are rectangular stainless steel open-ended boxes, if you like, that we drive into the soil with a hammer, and then we put water in them and measure the rate at which the water soaks in to the slots themselves. And in this case, if you look here, here's the bare soil without any slots in it at all, and it also happens to be how some of the U-shaped slots performed. If you actually look at the like the dots, so the power till opener was there, the squares was the undisturbed soil, so they were all gathered together. The horizontal slot increased the rate of infiltration to about 90 odd millimetres per minute, and that was after 120 minutes. But the V-shaped slot that did this compaction slowed it right down. So that's yet another biological minus for double disc openers. No wonder no tillage didn't thrive in the UK because all their openers in the start were double disc.
John, you've been talking about the invisibles. Let's come to carbon. You've mentioned carbon before, but of course it's invisible as well as visible. When we're talking about visibility, we're talking about an artist's palette and the leads in his pencil, that sort of thing.
Yeah, that's quite right. I mean, it is visible, but in fact where the world is most interested in its invisible form, carbon dioxide, which is our main glasshouse gas that hangs around. And a lot of people don't know, but when you cultivate a soil, you release something like 2 or 3 tons of carbon into the atmosphere, which is the organic matter in the soil being oxidized by the amount of oxygen you just let in there. If you look at a field like this, and this was Don Rakowski's photographs from the USDA in Missouri, here's a field that's been harvested. I think it looks like barley, straw, the residue, the straw has been taken off. If you go over to here, we plough that soil, we expose all of that organic matter that was in the root material underneath here, and that goes into the atmosphere, and believe it or not, scientists have estimated that something like 15 to 20% of the total CO2 in the atmosphere at any one time comes from the world ploughing its soils to feed itself. So if we could stop ploughing them, just do that and nothing else, you'd reduce the CO2 levels by 20%. A less aggressive cultivation emits less CO2. And then you get into the no-tillage. So these are the two no-tillage options. This is what most people do now, which is high disturbance no-tillage. I'd call it minimum tillage. Some people call it strip tillage. It's less CO2 emitting than that, but it's a whole lot more than that, which is low disturbance no-tillage. And that's where it doesn't look a whole lot different from the bare soil. That's what we should be doing. This simply isn't no-tillage. It's minimum tillage or strip tillage, and there's your 50%. We need to move from there to there before you're going to get 100% of the benefits of no-tillage. This is the extreme case of residues and disturbance. 5 cross-lot openers have, horizontal openers have gone through this very heavy residue in Ukraine. And the big thing is you can't see any soil, but on top of that, about 40% of that residue is carbon. Where did it come from? It came out of the atmosphere by photosynthesis, by the plants that were growing in here before they were harvested. Yes, we took the grain away, we had to eat that, that's why we grow them. But the world, while it tilled all its soils, was wasting all this. As often as not, it would burn it. A lot of openers simply can't handle that without getting blocked up, so they brush it aside. Ploughing it in is a waste of time because you release as much carbon as you put in there. All of those things point to the fact that if you really want to improve soil health and reduce the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, leave it on the surface, let it decompose, let the earthworms take it in, they'll thank you for it, and all the other microbes, but you've got to find openers that can do that without disturbing them. This is probably it is the ultimate that most soil conservators are aiming for now. Cover crops between the cash crops. None of this crop is going to be removed. It's been sprayed to kill it, and there are other ways of killing it organically with knife rollers. But the big thing is that the openers going through there are not getting blocked up, they're not hairpinning, they're putting the seed into a perfect environment. That's a couple of weeks after the machine passed. You can see the crops coming up perfectly happily. All of that residue will decompose, take its 40% carbon with it into the soil, start rebuilding the soil organic matter, which something like 3/4 of the organic matter in the world's arable soils has already been lost through tillage, so we've got to somehow get it back. This is the only way that you can do it on a huge scale. And then ultimately, of course, that crop grows into a harvestable crop, in this case millet. And that's the same crop that you've been looking at 3 different times. That will get harvested, that residue will decompose, more carbon will go in the ground, and the next crop will grow up. That's the cycle that we're trying to do with true low disturbance no-tillage.
John, you're making a case that it might be better if you and I were invisible, because you talked about the invisibilities, but there has to be some visible factors. Are they important? Are they substandard? What's the situation?
Absolutely, and I'm glad you brought this up, because we're not even doing the visible things all that well. I talked about the 50% things we were doing were visible and the others were invisible. That's a bit of a wild statement, because one of the things we don't do that's visible is sow the seed, or account for the fact that when we sow the seed into untilled soils, the soils vary in density. Now I've had arguments with agronomists, and so have many of my staff. Oh no, our soil is as even as you can get it. Rubbish. It's not. Walk across that field with a penetrometer and see how much it varies metre by metre. It's just a natural process of how the soil settled. But what we've got here, we invented a device on the cross-slot way back in 1993, and 1 or 2 other manufacturers have now attempted to copy it, but of course they haven't done it as well as we did, not in my opinion anyway. But what we've tried to do here in an animation is the yellow colouring at the top here and the bottom is actually supposed to be residue. You saw the residue get peeled back to expose the soil. The darker coloured soil here is harder, the lighter coloured is softer, and that's medium. So in both top and bottom of the slide, it's going through variable soil. If the downforce on the openers, and in our case that's oil pressure on a cylinder, remains constant, then the seeding depth, which is the green dots, won't be constant. It'll be shallower in the hard soil and deeper in the soft soil and about right in the medium soil, and then the cycle goes on again. So we invented a device that actually measures the density of the soil as the machine goes along, and I'm not going to go into how that's done. So in the bottom one here we've got what we call our auto downforce system operating, or ADF, and it's not the seed that's varying, it's actually the hydraulic pressure. It senses that this is hard soil here, so it increases the hydraulic pressure, pushes a bit harder, gets the seed back to its original depth, or pretty close to it. Softer soil, hang on, back off, otherwise this stuff's going to be way too deep. And so that thing is 3 times a second, which is about a metre, across the paddock. It is adjusting the oil pressure exactly as you see there, but the seeds are at a consistent depth. That's all visible stuff.
Dr. Baker, how can you quantify the differences for this? I mean, there are buyers out there are people in the audience that want to make an informed decision, an informed judgment on what to buy.
It's a very good question, and this is where the audience may actually turn to each other and have a little bit of mumbling. But I identified 25 different functions that a no-tillage opener should do, not in all circumstances. We talked about the 5 absolutely key ones, but there's a whole lot of others, like the ability to handle stones and work on slopes and sticky soils and what have you. And I took 7 generic opener types and scored them 1 to 5 as to how well they did each of these 29 things. And then added them all up at the end of the day to see what percentage of the desirable functions, these 29 functions, each of the generic types of openers did. And those are the results. Now, I kept it generic, so we're not actually talking about brand names. There's quite a lot of narrow hose used in the UK. Some wide hose sweeps are a bit unusual in the UK. They tend to be used in the drier soils in the States and Australia. Double disc, invented in the UK, very common. Single disc, also very common. And slanted disc, which is relatively uncommon, but in fact I think its origins were in South America, and this one happens to be the horizontal slot, cross slot, inverted T. The thing to notice is that take this middle group here, from wide hoe right through to slanted disc, they're all around about, they're performing all around about half of the functions that we think are important. Well, not that we think, it's actually a whole lot of science. The narrow hoe is a little bit better, it's performing about 2/3 of it, and the horizontal slot performs 94%.
John, 94% is impressive. It looks a bit like Joe Root's batting average. And with a name like Joe Root, he probably used cross slot, but how guaranteed is 94%?
Well, Joe Root might have done this in half the time that I did, but the significance of the 34% is that it took us 30 years to get this, to identify what was wrong with all of these ones and to correct them in a different design altogether. There's only one opener that makes horizontal slots, which is cross slot. And if it took us 30 years to do that, you might well ask the question, if it didn't come out at 94%, what the hell were we doing for the last 30 years? So I have no apology to make for that. It's scored on scientific evidence, not on my whims. And you saw in the field, it actually comes out that way as well. If you doubt any of the evidence, in 2006, the FAO of the United Nations commissioned us to write a book on all the science we knew about no tillage, some of which was created by our own research, but in fact there's 700 references in it, so a lot of it is other people's research as well. We started back in '67. We first wrote a book in '96, then we got this commissioned one by FAO. It's got 326 pages and it summaриses 26 grad students' work plus all the other work, and the sad thing is it's out of print. I can send you copies of the book by email, and FAO, I think it's on their website as well, so it is procurable, but not as a bound book right now.
John, I think I've got one of your books. I've got it alongside 50 Shades of Grey and Lady Chatterley. But let's move on. You mentioned earlier fertiliser banding. Now, how important is that?
It's peculiarly important in no tillage, to the extent that if you've got an untilled soil, there are a lot of worm channels and old root channels that are essentially pipelines from the surface downwards. So if you broadcast fertiliser onto no tillage, a good no tillage soil that hasn't been disturbed except in the slot zone, a lot of the soluble nutrients like nitrogen and potassium will just run down these pipelines and go right past the root zone, so the juvenile roots don't get it. It took us a while to work this out, because when we first started doing no tillage, often the crop looked pretty weak and yellow to start with. The other factor is that you've got the microbes decomposing all this residue, and they get first lick at the nitrogen, and so they gobble it up, and the seeds are actually short of nitrogen as they emerge. Now those microbes die later on in the cycle and the seeds get it, but when they emerge they quite often don't look as healthy as if you've done it in a cultivated soil. If you cultivate that soil, one is you break up all those channels and you've got a sort of even filter system, and you mineralise quite a lot of the nutrients that are in there, so everything comes out of the soil looking better. And it's unfortunately one of the reasons why people making no tillage openers have tended to till the soil and disturb the soil in the slot zone, because they get the benefit of this mineralised nitrogen, and the early seedlings look good compared with something sown into, say, a horizontal slot with the residue decomposing. So the only way that you can overcome that is to actually ban fertiliser at the time of sowing. Well, most openers, hoe openers, will allow you to do that without touching the fertiliser touching the seed. Disc openers won't, and so most people with disc openers simply don't put fertiliser down and hope for the best. One of the things about the horizontal slot, certainly the way that the cross lot makes it, is that in that soil you can see this disc slit. I've had this slide on before, but I didn't talk to this aspect of it. Here's the seed on one side of the split, there's the fertiliser on the other. Yes, they're reasonably close, but there's a slice, even if it collapses between them, and that's partly what accounts for the vigour of the seeds as they emerge. But again, in field activity, here's a crop in New Zealand. It wasn't an oilseed rape, but it was a brassica crop, a derivative of rape. Fertiliser down the spout, no fertiliser. And that's reflecting the bugs gobbling up the fertiliser and starving these guys. And then here's another slide, again in New Zealand, of a contractor was sowing this grass crop for a client, and he ran out of fertiliser near the end, and the farmer said to him, well, you keep drilling and I'll go home and get some fertiliser and spread it on with a spreader. So he did that, and that's what his part of the crop, the last round of the crop, looked like. The seeds are there, the plants are there, but the fertiliser just that he put on broadcast was just not active. It didn't, the plants never saw it, and so you got that effect. Most people would have looked at this and said, yeah, that's okay, but obviously it's not as good as where you put the fertiliser down the spout.
Dr. Baker, thank you very much for the informative address. What's the message that you want these delegates to take away?
Well, there's a few messages. The main message is just consistency and vigour of no tillage. This is an example of a wheat crop in Western Australia, and there aren't too many less friendly environments to grow cereals in, and certainly to establish them in the sandy soils of Western Australia. But when you can get this every year, regardless of the weather conditions, it transforms the ability of Western Australia to grow, in this case, wheat crops. This gentleman, some of you will be familiar with, Paul Alexander, who's not short. Paul's, I think, 6'4" or thereabouts, and he's standing in a canola crop that he sowed, the 6th crop sown with a crosslock drill on the same field, and it's pretty well touching 2 metres high, or pretty close to it. And you know, having a canola crop that's fence high, most people are pretty happy with it, but that's quite outstanding. More so that it's the 6th successive crop on that soil sown with a crosslock drill. And then at the other end of the scale, this is lucerne or alfalfa in Ukraine, small seed, perfect establishment. About the only sort of blemishes you can see is a few wheel tracks here when they were post-emergent spraying. There's one other way of looking at this thing, going back to the wet soil situation and the tendency of double disc and V-shaped slots to compact the soil versus the horizontal slot, which doesn't do any of that. The final message that I would actually like to give you is that was taken in the UK. That was a wheat plant sown in a V-shaped slot in the same field as a plant sown with a horizontal slot and fertiliser down the spout. What more can I say? Which one do you want?
Dr. Baker, thank you very much for your informative speech all the way from Fielding, New Zealand. Now, do you have an identity for us?
Well, there's me, and thank you for those words. All I want to re-emphasise is that we are halfway there, you're halfway there. Anybody that wants to discuss it with me, challenge me, anything, there's my email address, and I look forward to audience questions now, which I'll attempt to answer by Skype live from New Zealand, because they're going to be broadcast to me. I'm waiting up in the middle of the night to hear those questions and answer them live. So over to you.